I'm Tom Davies, and this is Collecting Stories, American Art. The development of American Impressionism is explored as young students studying in Europe came into contact with this new, transformative style of painting and struggled to adapt it to American tastes, as seen here in this powerful Gloucester Harbor Sea by George L. Noyes. Impressionism has had the most transformative impact on art from the turn of the century up to this day. However, you can't get to Impressionism without passing through a vital, although short-lived movement called Barbizon in Europe and its American adaptation called tonalism. This movement was essentially a bridge between the Hudson River School and Impressionists. Changes in taste and style overlap each other. It's not an abrupt shift. In fact, towards the late 19th century, many of the Hudson River artists were changing into tonalists, and later, many of the practitioners of tonalism were evolving into Impressionism. The change originated in France, with a number of names like Corot and Millet, rebelling against the strict teachings of the academies and espousing the belief that the common man, often in rural setting, was worthy subject matter to paint. It was a democratization of art. Scores of American students were studying in France and bringing back this viewpoint. Likewise, American tastes were rejecting the panoramic, highly detailed, monumental works of the Hudson River School and seeking a more poetic, intimate, smaller scale and narrower in focus style of painting. Often the American adaptation depicted sunset or sunrise. Small details in the landscape were considered unessential. The artist's objective was to create a mood or a tone. One of the earliest Hudson River School artists to reflect tonalism was Alexander Wyant. This judgment, however, is complicated. In 1873, in his mid-30s, he suffered a stroke, losing his right painting hand, and had to learn to paint with his left hand. This process was slow, but paintings showed his movement towards tonalism. The work became looser, less detailed, smaller in scope, and more somber in tone. Question, was this purely the result of the stroke and diminished skills? It is known that Wyant was already a great admirer of the major French Barbizon artists, and some experts feel he was moving in that direction earlier than most other American artists, but the process was hastened by the stroke. This piece is a good study for understanding the elements of tonalism, especially the silvery color of the sky and the soft reflection of the pond in the foreground. Is there such a thing as a subtle giant? Dwight Tryon is such an artist, has been throughout more than half a century, described as a late 19th century artist, a tonalism, and early Impressionism. Tryon was definitely influenced by the French Barbizon artists. He lived in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts for 40 years, where he evolved an ever more personal, more introspective, and more carefully observed rendering of the same fields and farmlands year after year. He continuously achieved a deeper understanding of the landscape. Tryon's work remained extremely popular from the 1880s until his passing in 1925. He was called the complete painter. Tryon taught art at Smith College for close to 40 years and was financially successful enough to endow the Tryon Gallery to Smith. Tryon became lifelong friends with Charles Freer, who was a mentor, and much of Tryon's work is in the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. In a letter to Freer, Tryon said, quote, "The summer of 1916 has been a record breaker for beauty." He went on to say his work had been, quote, "the most vibrant and translucent as stained glass." The date on this piece is 1916. A careful examination of the feathery brushwork suggests his continued move towards a subtle, carefully controlled, conservative Impressionism. In 1874, Claude Monet exhibited a painting in Paris, which resulted in a word and style of painting that forced its way into the art world, Impressionism. This painting, entitled Sunrise Impression, and it was fiercely attacked by the art critic Louis Leroy, who contemptuously labeled it a mere impression. The term stuck, as did the appeal of the work. Impressionism differs from earlier styles, espousing painting outdoors or plein air using pure, unmixed colors applied directly to the canvas in often overlapping brushstrokes or broken color, producing scintillating or vibrating color effects. This heightened the effect of light, blurring the outline of the objects, thus eliminating details and creating an overall impression. John Henry Twachtman was the first American artist to practice and teach the principles of Impressionism and founded the first of Connecticut's art colonies in Costigan around 1884. Even prior to the development of Impressionism, aspiring American artists were traveling to Europe to learn and study. But as the impact of Impressionism increased, by the 1880s, the floodgates were opened, and soon it became a virtual necessity or rite of passage for young artists to study and embrace the expatriate life in Paris, Pont-Aven, Giverny, and Grèze. Twachtman taught scores of students, and his farm in Greenwich became a meeting place for artists who would often room at the Bush Holly House. Twachtman's teachings and his paintings were greatly admired by the most important artists of the day, Weir, Hassam, Metcalf, and many others, who would visit, often for extended stays. But he was not commercially successful with the public, generally considered too experimental. This early piece of an old vessel docked in Cascab reflects his French training and Barbizon influence, and likely was painted in the mid-1880s. His later works often became so ethereal they almost approached abstraction. In spite of Twachtman's untimely death, prior to turning 50 years old, his paintings and teachings left an unmatched legacy on the development of Impressionism. Childe Hassam is a name pretty much written in gold. His well-to-do family roots go back to Nathaniel Hawthorne. Raised in Dorchester, Mass., his early studies were in Boston, under an instructor with my vote as the greatest name in American art, Ignaz Marcel Gauguin, and that really was his name. Today, Hassam is best known for his large, iconic snow scenes of New York streets lined with flags. They reached their peak depicting parades celebrating the victory of World War I. I've avoided talking prices of things, but Hassam's peak auction price was for a flag picture selling for over $12 million just a few months ago. Hassam made 5 extended trips to Europe over the course of his career, and his second trip in 1886 for 3 years set him on the path to be perhaps the most recognized American Impressionist during the late 1880s through to the time of his passing in 1935. His travels exposed him to paintings in East Hampton, Cascab, Greenwich, Old Lyme, Gloucester, Appledore, Maine, and many locations throughout Europe. This early watercolor, entitled Antwerp, 1883, was painted on Hassam's first trip to Europe before his conversion to Impressionism. Nevertheless, early signs are found in the flickering, spontaneous treatment of the tree leaves. Antwerp, Belgium, is the second largest city behind Brussels, and very much in the heart of Flemish country. It is the second largest port in Europe and linked to the North Sea by river. In addition to its importance as a port city, it is a major diamond center in Europe. This sensitive piece depicts a family of mother, father, and baby in the rear quarters of their tile roof farmhouse. It is one of 60 important watercolors he did, which were promptly exhibited in Boston upon his return to America. When discussing Impressionism and you don't have a Monet painting for reference, the next best thing is an important piece painted in Monet's pond, where he painted his famous lily pad series. In 1898, at age 23, Richard Miller departed his home in St. Louis for France, eventually settling in Giverny and becoming a close friend and often socializing with Monet and his family. Over his extended expatriate period, he won numerous gold medals, became acknowledged leader of the Anglo-American painters in France, and earned the country's highest accolade, Knight of the French Legion of Honor. His work was purchased by the French government for the Luxembourg Museum. This masterwork by Miller is entitled Un Bateau, and it's hard to imagine a composition more reflective of Impressionism by an American artist in France than this elegant lady boating on Monet's pond, where he painted his famous lily pad series. Perhaps the only thing prompting Miller to return to the United States in late 1914 was the outbreak of World War I. Miller spent a short period in 1916 to 18 in Pasadena, California, where he had a major influence spreading his concepts about Impressionism among the Southern California plein air painters. In 1918, he finally settled in P-Town, where he spent the remainder of his life. In the late 19th century, not many American artists were college graduates and also had a master's degree as well. George Obertueffer graduated from Princeton in 1900 and held a master's in fine arts from the Art Institute of Chicago. He departed for France in 1904 and remained there for 15 years. He met and married fellow student Henriette, and they often exhibited together, which seemed to benefit both their careers. Obertueffer was inspired by the Luxembourg Gardens, as well as the architecture of northern France. He taught in several of their art institutions and adapted many of the French Impressionists' approach of vigorous brushwork, thickly applied paint, vibrant color. Even upon his return to the U.S., despite realist subject matter, his spontaneous approach echoed the works of his friends and modernists like Arthur Carles and John Marin. Again, like many returning artists, Obertueffer taught art in several places: Philadelphia, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Memphis. I knew the artist's work before seeing this piece, and sometimes felt I wished that he had put another hour or two into it. It seemed too loose, not quite finished to my taste. This rural farm scene, painted in 1916, and most likely in Brittany, definitely seemed perfectly finished to me. However, not being farm raised, I have no attachment to barnyard animals. Yet I do like the geese in this painting. At least I think they're geese. Later in this series, we'll talk more about art colonies, but one of the more important and vibrant was in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in and around New Hope. In 1906, Robert Spencer was among the earliest arrivals in this colony. These artists were predominantly landscape painters, but Spencer preferred a different approach. Scenes of local factories and tenements, usually including the people that worked and lived in them. His fascination was in the design and placement of structures and figures in a landscape. Unlike the work of the Ashcan group of urban painters, Spencer was not attempting to make a social statement about city life and its difficulties. In 1913, Spencer produced what has been famously called his Mill series, and this work, entitled 1 O'Clock Break, is a quintessential piece from that group. It depicts the mill workers on their break. This series immortalized the Heath and Maris mills, constructed in 1707, which changed hands several times. Variously, they were grist mills, cotton mills, or silk mills. Spencer's total commitment to the principles of Impressionism is evident throughout the entire piece, but especially so in the flickering tree leaves and surface texture of the factory buildings. Sadly, a combination of 2 studio fires destroying a large quantity of his life's work and an increasingly unhappy marriage led Robert Spencer's suicide at 53 years old. This piece was exhibited at the Bruce Museum in 2005 on a show focusing on, quote, the beauty of work. Personally, I prefer the beauty of retirement. It's kind of impressive when one's paintings are described as virile, masculine, apt adjectives for Gardner Simon's work, who himself was characterized as a rugged, no-nonsense, plein-air painter. He developed a modification of traditional Impressionism with a broadened brushwork and enriched color palette. After a period in St. Ives, along with other artists, he returned to the United States in 1906. He established a studio in Laguna Beach and contributed to the development of Southern California Impressionism. But his primary studio was in Coleraine, Mass., where his masterpiece snow scenes were executed along the Deerfield River. Simons achieved great recognition as a leading snowscape painter during the first quarter of the 20th century. One critic wrote about his life and idyllic career. He exhibited widely, he sold well, he won all the prizes, and he succeeded in being truly bi-coastal in his appeal, which actually holds true to this day. Simon's work is proudly presented by West Coast dealers as a, quote, California plein-air master. Well, whenever I've been in that area, I react with a feigned naivete and I ask, wow, where do you get all that snow here? Usually followed by silence. It is interesting to note these 2 pieces were found more than 50 years after his passing in 1930, along with several others in an Army footlocker that had been stored in an artist friend's attic. In the first half of the 20th century, the most popular marine painter in the country was Frederick Waugh. To explain most popular, it means won more popular prizes than any other artist of the era. And this means prizes that voters of the exhibition get to vote on. This angry, turbulent view of the North Atlantic was painted in 1909, shortly after Waugh spent several years in Europe, especially living on the Isle of Sark in the English Channel. Here he studied every nuance and ebb and flow of the ocean before returning to America in 1907. He briefly settled in Maine, where this piece was painted on Bailey's Island, Casco Bay. The following year, 1910, Waugh resided on Rocky Neck in Gloucester, Massachusetts. The long shoreline between Gloucester and Rockport is called Bass Rocks, where this piece was likely painted. Frederick Waugh created a new genre, the pure marine. He did not rely on boats on the horizon, seagulls, figures on the beach, or umbrellas. He perfected 3 compositional devices: water and wave patterns, rocks and the shoreline, sky and cloud formations. From these elements, Frederick Waugh created marine masterpieces found in museums throughout the country. Many artists, from the earliest to the present day, become so enamored with the changes of seasons, they embark upon a 4-season series. They select a favorite spot or composition and paint it in each of the 4 seasons. When these have been found intact It's quite exciting. Frank Swift Chase painted this brilliant autumn picture, executed at the peak of the fall foliage period when the colors are at their most vibrant. Chase was the assistant director of the Woodstock Art School, roughly 100 miles north of New York. This very large painting was executed in the area around Woodstock and is the quote autumn piece of a four-season group by Chase. I've seen the spring, but neither the summer nor the winter. Chase was an outgoing, optimistic person who was a strong colorist and an impressionist who loved to paint with a loaded brush and was an avid hunter, fisherman, and amateur boxer. However, of questionable significance, the comedian Chevy Chase is Frank Chase's grand-nephew. The second art colony to develop in Connecticut was in Silvermine, a picturesque wooded area that extends into the towns of New Canaan, Wilton, and Norwalk. Despite its name, there is no confirmed evidence of discovering silver or even the existence of a silver mine. I think in today's words, we'd call it fake news. The first to settle in Silvermine in 1906 was the sculptor Solon Borglum, the brother of Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. This brilliantly colored landscape is by Charles Reiffel, who arrived in Silvermine in 1912 after a 6-year stay in Europe. As membership expanded, they formed the Knockers Club, which met every Sunday in Borglum's barn to critique or, quote, knock each other's work. As one writer of the day put it, each member is assured of frank and competent criticism, which may not augment self-esteem, but it is very likely will result in self-improvement. Charles Reiffel was considered something of a modernist, but still the most accomplished landscape painter of the group. Reiffel was active in the group during the 12 years he remained in Silvermine, and he served as the president of Silvermine's Artists Guild. In 1924, he was vacationing in Southern California, and a chance snowstorm diverted him to a largely untouched backcountry area of San Diego. He fell in love with the place, and he remained there the rest of his career as a very successful Southern California impressionist. Winter's snow is a wonderful subject for impressionist artists to paint. Reflected light and color provide the artist stimulating creative choices, but hanging laundry is a wonderful tool, giving the artist permission to inject any color and shapes into the composition that ordinarily would not appear in nature. This is a powerful device. The artist is Wilson Irvine, and the location is Old Lyme. Irvine's start began in Chicago, where he studied, exhibited, belonged to numerous local organizations. However, the seemingly restless nature prompted him to frequent and lengthy travels throughout his career, including Cornwall, England, Wales, the Outer Hebrides, London, Glasgow, Paris, Quebec, Avignon, New Orleans, Charleston, and many more. Irvine did settle into Old Lyme in 1918 and remained there until his passing in 1936. Widely respected as an experimenter, Irvine developed new techniques for monoprints and aquatints, as well as executing his impressionist painting in a style that he called prismatic painting, or trying to create images that appear to be seen through a prism. Irvine was a solid and prolific artist, and although he remained a realist in the face of modernism, he did not stand still. He continued to experiment and evolve. Picture an aristocratic 6'4" tall gentleman strolling the streets of New Canaan, an impressive sight. Daniel Putnam Brinley was a New Canaan resident and a founding member of the Silvermine Art Colony, who became its president in 1923. He was raised in Cascade, whose family ancestry went back to the Revolutionary War general Israel Putnam. This painting is clearly not New Canaan, but the story behind it is. Picture a blistering hot July day in 1983, at our annual sidewalk sale. From my nice, air conditioned room, I was reluctantly dragged by my wife and kids to endure heat, loud street bands, melting ice cream cones, and lots of shoes, socks, shirts, and other things I didn't need or want. Amid the noise and crowds, I discovered a very large corrugated box outside of an antique shop, filled with what appeared to be burnt frames. Well, I was told they had been in a home that had had an attic fire and were covered with soot. I started rummaging through the empty frames up to my elbows in soot until I felt a small frame with a blackened canvas board in it. Brushing the soot aside, read on the back, Gloucester Harbor. Whoa, what is this? I wetted my finger and rubbed the right corner. Nothing. Then the left corner to reveal a sea of bright blue and the name Brinley. Well, I immediately replaced the soot on both corners, of course, restoring it to its original condition, and asked the dealer what was the cost of a burnt frame and a charred board. The price, $3. With cleaning and an appropriate frame, I had an early, pure broken color Impressionist piece by Daniel Putnam Brinley. These high-key, classic Impressionist works were fairly rare. Brinley's style changed to a more mannered post-Impressionist technique, which he frequently used when he painted murals as seen here or worked with stained glass. I must admit, I've been to many sidewalk sales since, looking for another large corrugated box full of discarded frames. Thus far, no luck. William Lester Stevens' bios emphasize an eccentric, often prickly personality, an heroic work ethic, a prodigious exhibitor who it's said won more prizes and awards than any artist of his era, a fine mind, an avid reader. He told his students, quote, "A good painting starts with a good brain." He loved the physical act of painting and pursued it with a passion. It's said when a piece was finished, he'd cast it aside out of desire to start the next one. If his wife didn't gather up the works, he'd likely step on them. His pipe was with him at all times, especially when teaching. While gesturing excitedly in front of a class, he removed his lit pipe, tapped it, and thinking it was out, stuffed it into his hip pocket. It wasn't, and his pants caught fire. He was a founder of the Rockport Art Association, and his best work was done while he resided on Cape Ann. By 1934, he felt the area was just too crowded, overrun with tourists and Sunday painters. He abruptly left and moved to the Berkshires, where he remained for the rest of his life. This autumn landscape was painted in 1925 and is an outstanding example of broken color Impressionism. One can see in this piece American Impressionists adopted many of the French techniques, but were unwilling to sacrifice form to the extent the French did, and this piece demonstrates that. Orphaned at 12, raised by his famous cousin, George M. Cohan, extensive action in the Argonne Forest with the 53rd Infantry Division in World War I. John Costigan abandoned the illustration world of New York City to retreat to an 11-acre farm 25 miles north of the city and remain there for the last 53 years of his life. Here, he evolved a totally unique and visually distinctive style, while focusing on his family, farm animals, and wooded property as subjects for his paintings. Totally self-taught, he applied paint thickly, resulting in peaks and valleys resembling a topographical map, with channels and grooves of paint and vibrant colors. Critics often called it a crushed jewel effect or dappled confusion. Costigan was often referred to as a pastoralist. Despite his repetitive theme, Costigan was held in deep respect, with prizes won, museum representations, and National Academy membership. The dominant season in his work is autumn, and its blazing colors. Winter is very rare. A chance encounter with Costigan's self-proclaimed biographer, led to a statement that the Los Angeles County Museum of Art's single most popular painting in the museum is a major winter piece by John Costigan. Challenging this rather brash statement, I was told the museum sells postcard images of its collection, and the Costigan postcard snow piece outsells all others. Interesting, convincing, but you can draw your own conclusions. Experiencing parental disapproval of his desire to be a painter, Dutch-born Anthony Teamy left home at 17 to pursue art school and immigrated to the United States in the late 1920s. Teamy worked as a stage set designer in Boston before moving to Rockport in 1929. Teamy's success came quickly. His paintings made famous a red lobsterman's shack purchased at the end of a granite pier, which you see here. It became known as Motif Number 1 and claims to be the most frequently painted structure in the country. I believe it. It is appropriate that the first picture containing the motif in the composition is by Anthony Teamy, who reputedly painted it more often than any other artist. However, it is more appropriate to emphasize the challenge an artist faces to find something original in the painting of a subject that has been painted before at least 1,000 times or more. As in this piece, the structure is not center stage in a familiar form. It's partially rendered off to the left. Artists, like the rest of us, make many choices throughout life. Teamy's worst choice was his wife, Lillian. There are many words to describe her, but bitchy covers it quite well. Every morning when she left their home to go shopping, she would tell Tony how many finished and how many good starts she expected to see upon returning home. After she left, he'd go down to the fire station to play pinochle with the firemen. When Lillian's return grew closer, he'd race back home and start painting. Teamy was a complex man. Felt he was born out of his time, often struggling with despair over the evolution of modern life, technology, and progress. The Teamys frequently departed New England in the winter and drove to Florida. In 1954, the Florida trip got as far as Greenwich, Connecticut, and I suspect, with Lillian's persistent help, Anthony Teamy took his life. To revisit the fame and the recognition that Motif Number 1 achieved, in no small measure to Teamy's paintings, here is one of the numerous print ads featuring the iconic building that has appeared over the years. The final Impressionist piece displayed something quite weird. It talked to me. I'll explain. But the artist is Canadian-born, of American parents, George L. Noyes. With the accidental passing of his father, his mother and 3 children moved back to Boston and struggled to support the young family by running a boarding house. She supported her son's study in art at age 15, apprenticing first in a glass factory, and eventually 4 years' study in Europe. His career blossomed, exhibitions, prizes, awards, and producing outstanding works of this caliber. My fondness for coastal and harbor scenes went right off the deep end when I saw this piece by George Noyes illustrating the cover of a dealer's catalog. Well, this was in 1985, and the dealer was a friend that I knew quite well. It was sold by the time I received the catalog. Now, moving forward, 6 years elapsed since I first saw this piece on the catalog cover. I was in my office, and for absolutely no normal reason at all, this piece popped into my head. While thinking about it, the phone rang. It was the dealer who originally advertised it, and he started by saying he had just purchased something significant. I interrupted and I said, "The G.L. Noyes of Gloucester Harbor, right?" "Well, a significant trade and 6 months of payments, and the yawl that you see here was mine." They say the right piece of art can talk to you. This one did. For our next segment, Where Painters Gather, Art Colonies in America.